The 13-year-old girl felt the cold marble beneath her knees as the priest raised the sacred knife above her head. But this wasn't a sacrifice of flesh. It was something far worse. The cutting of her hair marked the death of everything she had been, and the birth of something Rome's historians would later call living statues. Welcome back to the Hollow Throne, where we uncover the darkest chapters of human history. I'm your host, and today we're traveling to ancient Greece, not the sanitized version from your history books, but the real Greece, where sacred duty often meant a lifetime of suffering. You've probably heard of the Vestal Virgins of Rome, but what you might not know is that the Greeks pioneered many of these practices centuries earlier. From the Oracle of Delphi to the Arctoi of Artemis, ancient Greece created elaborate systems where young women were isolated, controlled, and sometimes destroyed in the name of divine service. Today we'll uncover 5 shocking cases that reveal how Greek religious practice masked systematic abuse. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some modern scholars call these institutions sacred prisons, and why the archaeological evidence still makes researchers uncomfortable. But first, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the algorithm seems to suppress videos about historical abuse, and I need your help to make sure these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Let's start with how it began, the selection process that turned children into property of the gods. Unlike Rome's more organized system, Greek city-states developed their own methods for acquiring sacred virgins, but the underlying pattern was always the same: take them young, isolate them completely, and make the cost of failure so terrifying that absolute obedience became the only option for survival. From Epidaurus details. The requirements for temple service. Girls between the ages of 7 and 14, of noble birth, physically perfect and, here's where it gets disturbing, emotionally suitable for long-term isolation. According to Dr. Sarah Iles Johnston's research at Ohio State, these weren't voluntary positions. Families were legally compelled to provide daughters when the temples made demands. The Greek word used, hierodoli, literally translates to sacred slave. Picture this. You're a wealthy Athenian merchant. Your 8-year-old daughter is bright, beautiful, and beloved. Then the priests arrive. They examine her teeth like livestock, check her posture, ask her to recite poetry. If she passes their tests, she becomes theirs. No negotiation, no appeals. Sacred law trumped parental love every time. But the selection was just the beginning. What happened next would determine whether these girls survived their service, or became the subjects of the disturbing archaeological discoveries we'll explore later in this video. Our first case study takes us to Brauron, about 40 kilometers from Athens, where young girls served as arctoi, little bears, in the cult of Artemis. The official story sounds almost innocent. Girls between ages 5 and 10 would spend a year playing the bear for Artemis, goddess of the hunt and childbirth. They wore saffron robes, participated in sacred dances, and helped maintain the temple. Aristocratic families considered it an honor, but the archaeological evidence tells a different story. In 1956, archaeologist John Papadimitriou made a discovery that changed everything. Beneath the temple's main altar, he found a mass grave containing the remains of over 40 young females, aged between 5 and 15. The bone analysis revealed signs of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and this is difficult to discuss, evidence of systematic abuse. The 1982 study by Dr. Maria Sergidou documented something even more disturbing: small iron restraints sized for children, discovered in what were once the dormitory areas. These weren't decorative, they were functional. As classical archaeologist Dr. Joan Breton Connolly notes in her groundbreaking work, the little bears weren't playing, they were prisoners. The saffron robes hid rope burns. The sacred dances masked choreographed submission. The daily routine was designed to break individual will. The girls were awakened before dawn for purification rituals that involved ice-cold baths, regardless of weather. They weren't allowed to speak to each other during daylight hours. Any infraction minus crying for their mothers, attempting to leave the sacred grounds, showing insufficient devotion, resulted in punishment. But the punishment system at Brauron was particularly cruel, even by ancient standards. The priests had developed what they called sacred correction, a process so traumatic that some girls never recovered their ability to speak, and this was considered the gentle cult. Wait until you hear about what happened at Adolkina. The island of Adolkina housed one of the most secretive cults in the ancient world, the mysteries of Hecate, goddess of magic, crossroads, and the underworld. What happened in those underground chambers stayed hidden for over 2,000 years. Until 1994, when construction workers building a hotel accidentally broke through into a network of underground chambers that shouldn't have existed. What they found defied explanation. a complex of rooms carved directly into the bedrock, accessible only through a narrow shaft that could be sealed from above. The chambers were filled with artifacts that told a story of systematic psychological torture disguised as religious initiation. Elena Corker, director of the excavation, documented the findings: sensory deprivation chambers with no light sources, restraint systems built into the walls, and dozens of small clay tablets with what appeared to be desperate messages scratched by fingernails. When linguist Dr. Andreas Nicolaou translated the tablets, the messages were heartbreaking. "My name is Phyllis, daughter of Kretinos. I have been here since the autumn moon. Please remember me." Another: "They say the goddess speaks through pain. I hear nothing but screaming." The Hecate cult's methods were particularly sophisticated. According to Dr. Sarah Pomeroy's analysis, they used psychological techniques that wouldn't be formally understood until the 20th century. Sleep deprivation, social isolation, controlled trauma, and something called learned helplessness. New initiates, usually between ages 12 and 16, were lowered into the chambers during the new moon. They would spend 3 days in complete darkness with minimal food and water. On the 4th day, they were brought before the priestess for divine communication. This is from a 3rd century BCE papyrus found in the chamber. The goddess whispers through suffering. Only when the self is broken can the divine enter. The girl who descends is not the woman who ascends. But here's what makes this case particularly tragic. Modern psychological analysis of the artifacts suggests that many of these girls never truly recovered. They spent the rest of their lives serving a cult that had deliberately traumatized them, unable to imagine any other existence. The Aegina discoveries forced archaeologists to re-examine similar sites across Greece. What they found at Eleusis would challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient religious practices. Eleusis held the most famous mystery cult in the ancient world. For over 2,000 years, initiates traveled from across the Mediterranean to participate in secret rituals that promised salvation and enlightenment. The proceedings were so sacred that revealing the mysteries carried the death penalty. The official mythology centered on Demeter's search for her daughter Persephone, who had been abducted to the underworld. The rituals supposedly reenacted this cosmic drama, offering initiates a preview of life after death. But in 2003, forensic archaeologist Dr. Marina Panayotou made a discovery that suggested something far darker was happening in those sacred halls. While examining previously overlooked artifacts in the Eleusis Museum, Dr. Panayotou noticed something troubling about the female figurines found in the sanctuary. Under microscopic analysis, many showed signs of having been deliberately broken and repaired, not once but repeatedly. As she explains in her controversial 2007 paper, these weren't ritual objects. They were training tools. Someone was teaching systematic dismantling and reconstruction, not of clay but of human psychology. The breakthrough came when Dr. Panayotou cross-referenced the figurine patterns with ancient medical texts. She discovered that Greek physicians had documented a condition they called sacred madness, specifically affecting young women who had participated in mystery cults. This is from the physician Soranus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century CE. The afflicted maidens exhibit signs of deliberate memory disruption. They speak of seeing their own deaths, of being torn apart and remade. They cannot recall their names from before the sacred time, yet they remember every detail of their dissolution. Modern trauma specialists who reviewed these accounts identified them as descriptions of deliberately induced dissociative disorders. The Eleusis mysteries weren't offering spiritual enlightenment, they were performing psychological experiments on vulnerable young women. This theory remains highly controversial. The established archaeological community has largely rejected Dr. Panayotou's findings, arguing that she's reading modern concepts into ancient practices, but her research has found support among trauma specialists and forensic psychologists. The debate might have remained academic, except for what happened next. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar revealed something beneath Eleusis that forced everyone to consider. Sometimes the Earth keeps secrets that humans prefer to forget. In 2019, a team from the University of Athens was conducting routine ground surveys at Eleusis when their equipment detected something unexpected, a vast underground complex that didn't appear on any ancient plans. The radar images showed a network of chambers extending far beneath the known temple structures. Some were massive, large enough to hold hundreds of people. Others were smaller, cell-like spaces arranged in precise geometric patterns. Dr. Dimitris Matsas, leading the dig, initially expected to find storage areas or administrative spaces. What they actually uncovered was far more disturbing. The first chamber yielded hundreds of small personal items, jewelry, hair ornaments, children's toys, all carefully arranged as if in a memorial. Carbon dating placed them across nearly 8 centuries of continuous use. But it was the second chamber that changed everything. The team found what can only be described as an ancient laboratory, stone tables with restraint grooves. implements whose purpose became clear only when compared to modern psychological research equipment, and detailed records carved into the walls. Dr. Anastasia Chrysostomou, specialist in ancient medical practices, examined the carvings. These aren't religious texts, they're experimental notes. Someone was systematically documenting the effects of various traumatic procedures on human subjects. The records describe what they called divine dismantling, a process of breaking down personality and memory, then rebuilding the subject according to specific requirements. The technical precision is chilling. They had identified what modern psychology would recognize as dissociation triggers, memory disruption techniques, and dependency creation methods. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the records show this wasn't random cruelty, it was organized research. Someone was trying to understand how to completely control human consciousness, and they were using sacred rituals as cover for their experiments. The psychological damage done in places like Eleusis didn't end when the rituals concluded. The women who survived these ordeals faced a lifetime of consequences that ancient society was neither willing nor able to address. What happened to the sacred virgins when their service ended? This question haunted me as I researched this video, because the historical record suddenly goes silent. Women who had been central figures in their communities simply disappear from the sources. The answer came from an unexpected source: graffiti. In 2015, archaeologists studying wall inscriptions in various Greek cities began noticing a pattern: short, desperate messages carved into public buildings, all signed with variations of former priestess or she who served the gods. I cannot remember my mother's face. The dreams never stop. They say I am free, but I am still in the chamber. My hands shake when I try to pray to any god. Dr. Ruby Blondell from the University of Washington has spent years studying these inscriptions. Her conclusion is devastating. These women were exhibiting what we now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Ancient society had no framework for understanding or treating their condition. The few detailed accounts that survive paint a picture of systematic social abandonment. Former priestesses were considered touched by the gods, a designation that sounds positive until you realize it meant they were viewed as fundamentally different from normal humans. The philosopher Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, describes encountering a former oracle. She spoke as one who had seen beyond the veil of death, but her eyes held no wisdom, only the emptiness of one who had been hollowed out to make room for divine presence. Modern medical experts who have reviewed these descriptions identify clear symptoms of severe dissociative disorders, chronic depression, and what we now call learned helplessness syndrome. Of the 23 former priestesses whose fates can be traced through historical records, 19 died within 5 years of leaving their temples. The causes listed include wasting sickness, divine madness, and simple failure to thrive, ancient euphemisms for what we would recognize as trauma-related deaths. Take the case of Pythia Aristonic, who served at Delphi for 12 years before being retired due to age. Contemporary accounts describe a woman who could no longer speak in normal conversation, only in the fragmented, oracular style she had been trained to use. She starved to death because she had forgotten how to ask for food in ordinary language. These accounts read disturbingly similar to modern reports from survivors of extreme cults or systematic abuse. The psychological techniques used in ancient Greek religious practice mirror methods that contemporary therapists recognize as deliberate trauma programming. No discussion of Greek sacred virgins is complete without examining the most famous and possibly most tragic case of all, the Oracle of Delphi. For over 1,000 years, the most powerful people in the ancient world traveled to Delphi to consult the Pythia, a young woman who channeled the god Apollo to deliver prophecies that shaped the course of history. The traditional story presents the oracle as a revered figure, honored above all other women in Greek society. But modern archaeological and toxicological research has revealed something far more sinister. In 2001, geologist Jella de Boer and archaeologist John Hale made a breakthrough discovery. Using modern geological surveys, they confirmed that the oracle's chamber sat directly over intersecting fault lines that released ethylene gas, a substance that produces euphoria, hallucinations, and memory loss. Dr. Henry Spiller, director of the Kentucky Regional Poison Control Center, analyzed the described symptoms. Chronic ethylene exposure produces severe neurological damage. These women weren't channeling gods, they were being systematically poisoned. When we re-examine the historical accounts with this knowledge, a horrifying pattern emerges. The Pythia position had a life expectancy of less than 7 years. The ancient sources present this as the will of Apollo, but modern medical analysis suggests deliberate chemical brain damage. The selection criteria for new Pythias become even more disturbing in this context. They specifically chose young women from isolated mountain villages, girls who had no powerful families to protect them or investigate their deaths. Ancient sources describe a preparation period where new Pythias were gradually opened to divine influence. We now understand this as systematic exposure to increasing levels of toxic gas until their nervous systems were permanently damaged. The priests maintained complete control over the oracle's contact with the outside world. She lived in isolation, ate only food prepared by temple staff, and interacted only with religious officials who interpreted her chemically induced ravings as divine prophecy. Perhaps most tragic of all, there's evidence that some Pythias retained enough awareness to understand what was happening to them. Inscriptions found in the temple's private areas include desperate pleas, "Let me die as myself, not as your puppet god." The Oracle of Delphi represents the ultimate expression of institutional abuse disguised as religious honor. The most celebrated woman in the ancient world was actually a victim of systematic chemical torture, her suffering packaged as divine service. Here's where this story takes a modern twist that's almost as disturbing as the ancient practices themselves. The archaeological evidence I've been describing hasn't been hidden away in obscure journals. It's been actively suppressed by major academic institutions. When Dr. Panayotou published her findings about systematic abuse in Greek mystery cults, the response wasn't scholarly debate, it was institutional retaliation. Her research funding was cut, her tenure-track position was eliminated, and several major journals refused to publish her follow-up studies. As she told me in a recent email, the classical archaeology establishment has too much invested in romanticized narratives about ancient Greece. Evidence of systematic abuse doesn't fit the image they've spent careers building. The suppression isn't just academic, it's economic. Greece's tourism industry depends heavily on romantic notions about ancient civilization. Sites like Delphi and Eleusis generate millions in revenue annually. Acknowledging these locations as scenes of systematic abuse would be financially devastating. The underground chambers at Eleusis, still classified as storage areas in official site materials. The mass grave at Brorum, described as a consecrated burial ground with no mention of the trauma evidence. The restraint systems, listed as ritual furniture in museum catalogues. Dr. Chrysostomou, the medical specialist who analyzed the Eleusis carvings, has faced similar retaliation. "I've been told explicitly that pursuing this research will end my career. The message is clear, some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge." The suppression extends beyond Greece. International archaeological organizations have refused to fund research into abuse patterns at Greek religious sites. Conferences have rejected papers on the topic. Academic publishers have imposed informal bans on related publications. This isn't just about ancient history. The same institutional patterns that enabled systematic abuse in ancient Greece are still operating today. When we refuse to acknowledge historical trauma, we create conditions for contemporary atrocities to remain hidden. The evidence exists, the patterns are clear, but as long as powerful institutions prioritize comfortable myths over uncomfortable truths, the voices of these ancient victims will remain silenced. As I stand here among the ruins of what were once considered the most sacred sites in the ancient world, I'm haunted by a simple question. How many times has this story repeated itself throughout history? The Greek system of sacred virgins wasn't unique. It was a template. Similar patterns of institutionalized abuse disguised as religious honor appear in cultures across the globe and throughout time. The specifics change, but the underlying mechanisms remain remarkably consistent. Today we like to think we've evolved beyond such barbarity. But have we? Modern investigations have uncovered systematic abuse in religious institutions, elite boarding schools, youth sports programs, and countless other organizations that claim to serve children's highest interests. The warning signs are always the same: isolation from family support systems, ideology that frames suffering as virtue, authority figures who claim divine or institutional mandate, and societies that prefer comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. The scratch marks on chamber walls, the desperate graffiti in ancient cities, the medical evidence of systematic trauma, these aren't just historical curiosities. They're testimonies from victims who found ways to leave evidence despite their oppressors' best efforts to erase them. We owe it to these ancient victims, and to potential future victims, to acknowledge what really happened in these places. Not the sanitized version that sells tourism packages, but the brutal reality that archaeological evidence reveals. The sacred virgins of ancient Greece were real people with real names, real families, real dreams that were systematically destroyed in the name of divine service. Their suffering wasn't mythological, it was documented, deliberate and preventable. By understanding their stories, by refusing to let institutional pressure bury inconvenient truths, by recognizing the patterns that enabled their abuse, we honor their memory and protect future generations from similar fates. Thank you for watching this difficult but necessary exploration of one of history's darkest chapters. If this video has affected you, please know that resources for trauma support are available. I've included links in the description. Subscribe to the Hollow Throne for more investigations into history's hidden horrors. Share this video if you believe these stories deserve to be told. And remember, the price of civilization isn't measured in glory, but in the suffering we're willing to acknowledge and prevent. Until next time, this has been the Hollow Throne, where we refuse to let the powerful bury the voices of the powerless.